Well, good evening, everybody. It is Paul Woodadge here for World War II TV. We have some technical issues with some of our guests, which is half of the course on a big panel like this. But here we are for our Star Wars World War II crossover show. So I have various guests, some of whom are here and some of whom are having problems. But joining us, we have Alan Allport, best-selling author of World War II, social historian, military historian, Matt Bone, K.R. Paul, angry staff officer with his famous blog, Zana, who is a military historian and teacher, and hopefully, if his audio works, we've got Jack McKenzie, who's there. We can see him. We can't hear him yet, who was actually in The Empire Strikes Back, which is pretty damn cool. And we've got another 8th guest, Jess, who is trying to join us, and Jess is an archaeologist. So we are going to discuss all things Star Wars with World War II connections. We all know about the obvious things like the fact that the Star Wars End of New Hope, the Death Star approach is kind of based on the Dambusters and 633 Squadron, but there's lots more than that. So we're going to start off with a little bit about the why there should be some connections between World War II and Star Wars. And I think the main reason is when it was filmed. We just, before going live, the first film was filmed in 1975-76, so just 30 years after the war. A lot of the people working on it, model makers, the art directors, they had been people who had been in the war. They remembered the war. Their parents had served in the war. So their inspiration obviously came from Lancaster bombers and Spitfires and everything as well. So that's, I guess, where the World War II thing came from. But it's not about me rabbiting on all night. We want to have some other people join in. So I'm going to bring you in first, Matt, because you're kind of an old hand at these discussions on World War II TV, Naffy Natters. So, Matt, let's start off with the kind of the equipment that you see from World War II in the Star Wars universe, and why we see World War II equipment in the Star Wars audience. So, get the ball rolling and say something.
Say something. Hopefully, it'll be something good. Well, as you said, it was the frame of reference. You know, the story is fantastical, but if you want to make it believable, you have to ground it in something. So, you know, if you take the attack on the Death Star, which you opened with, in that is possibly every Second World War movie cliche you can throw in. You've got the X-wings rolling in a half roll like the Spitfires did in the Battle of Britain. Due to carburetor issues, which I'm sure we'll come back to later. You've got the trench run, which they used the run of the film of the Dambusters going through to the dams. Even the aircraft calling in, Red 5 standing by. That's all straight out of the Dambusters. You could say it's a cheat, but what it actually does is that it brings you through into this world that you kind of know, but you don't. So all throughout the film, there's these little touches that give you a grounding from the films that you've grown up on into this new galaxy far, far away that has so much more to offer. And, that's probably the genius of Lucas and the guys at ILM for being able to meld these two areas together, because by bringing us things that we know, we're more willing to believe the stuff that we've never seen before, and that still wows us 40 odd years later.
Yeah, and I think it's to do with that science fiction films in the 50s and 60s. Everything was wrapped in tin foil, wasn't it? And it was trying too much to be futuristic and ends up looking crap now. Whereas, the Star Wars universe had this grounding in reality. As you said there, Matt, the speak sounded like RAF pilots talking. It sounded like, bombers going into Germany. And the equipment and stuff we saw was stuff we were familiar with from our own universe. So it meant that although the Star Wars universe was a long way away and distant in the past, it had this grounding of reality. It was dirty, wasn't it? It was grungy. It had this lived-in look of a world, or a system that had been in existence for a long time. So I'm gonna bring Alan in next, because I saw him having a crafty sip of tea there, because you live in the USA now, Alan, but you're English like me, and you're similar age. You grew up with the Star Wars thing, and you're a military historian. You write about military history. How does Star Wars and World War II connect for you? I mean, you obviously wanted to join in this panel. Where does the connection come?
Well, okay. So I'll bore you with a personal anecdote first. So the very, very first bit of Star Wars footage I ever saw probably would have been in about, I can't remember exactly, but it would have been probably the second half of 1977. This was before, this was when the film had been released in America, but it hadn't been released in England yet. I think it was released in December that year. And they must have been sending round, in fact, I think if I remember rightly, so Fox was sending round clips of the film to schools to sort of drum up publicity. And we had, this was at Wystan Willis Junior School in just in Liverpool. And they had this clip of like 16mm film or whatever of the bit where the Millennium Falcon is just escaping from the Death Star, and they encounter the Picket TIE fighters, and they have that little combat thing. And that was, so it's I don't know, the sequence is probably about 5 minutes long, and that was the very first bit of Star Wars I ever saw, and it's still my favorite bit as a result. And the thing that I don't know whether I was consciously aware of it at the time, although I think I might have been, which is that quite obviously, if you watch that sequence, it's the Millennium Falcon's a B-17, isn't it? I mean, it's a it's a flying fortress. It's somewhere over Bremen or whatever, and it's having a go. It's having a pop at BF-109s or Focke-Wulfs or whatever, and it completely works, even though it's also total nonsense if you actually think about it for more than 30 seconds. I mean, why on earth that in this space age era where they've got hyperspace and everything, why they're still sitting there in these little turrets, manually aiming the guns, when presumably a computer could probably handle this quite well. It doesn't make any sense at all, but it works perfectly. And of course, I mean, everyone probably knows this anyway, but I mean, the original footage before the special effects were put in was World War II combat footage from films like Tora 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 and so forth, and then they had just superimposed the other ships on it. So you can understand exactly the reason that they're making all of these maneuvers that look exactly like World War II footage is because that's what they're doing. It's just superimposed on. So I think the connection was there right from the beginning. Then I mean, in a bigger sense, the first three films, as in the first three films that were made, I think sort of follow that, a somewhat mythical view of the Second World War anyway, and that it's not particularly difficult to identify both from the aesthetic and their behavior, the Empire as being the Germans, being the Nazis, and but partly because of course they all speak English, British English, and then the rebels being the somewhat slightly more laid back allies who are kind of a mixture of I mean, they're mostly Americans, aren't they, with a smattering of Brits in. But it's a good and evil story, isn't it? It's the classic World War II myth. I mean, I think in some ways, I this is a particular hill. I'll stop in a moment, but I mean, one of the particular boring hills that I will die on is that although in many ways they are objectively crap, the prequel movies, the three prequel movies from Phantom Menace to Send in the Clones to what's the third one? Revenge of the Sith. I actually think that's a more interesting story arc. I mean, I think it's far more sophisticated story arc than Star Wars is, and it's basically William Shirer's book about the Third Reich, isn't it? It's about this is about how Hitler comes to power, and it makes for a far more, in terms of narrative storytelling, it's actually a far cleverer and more interesting story, even though it's a bit crap in terms of how they actually executed it. But both of them in their own ways deal with the 30s and the 40s. All right, I will leave
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, whether have we got Jesse's video? Because Jess has done some research into George Lucas and George Lucas's background, and where we can bring that in. But let's bring in two people who've actually written about the military and Star Wars. So either Kara or Stafford, which one of you wants to go first and talk about your sort of understanding of the military in Star Wars? Okay, we'll go.
I can go first if you want.
Right, we'll go with you.
So I thought I like the point you made about, for a lot of you guys, this was kind of like, this was early on in your life. You got to see it very early on. I grew up watching Star Wars. I'm young enough, I don't have enough wrinkles that I saw it on in the theaters. But I did grow up seeing the original Star Wars before the newest, like the prequel trilogy came out. And I think that's what pushed me to write the article for Staffer. Was a lot of people these days, that was like kind of their intro to the military. And I think it is because it ties so strongly back to World War II. Of course, that being said, I think everybody's pretty aware of my opinion that I think that their ability to do any kind of strategic work is seriously lacking. But the symbology part, again, the very good versus evil kind of look, in the most recent trilogy, I thought it was really striking that in the very first movie, when you see Rey, she's almost always dressed in very pale tan or white clothing. Then towards the middle movie, similar to the middle movie in the original trilogy, you see her wardrobe moves to much darker colors. They're much darker grays. They bring in a lot more blacks. And then as she kind of completes the rest of that arc, the symbology completes itself, and she's in lighter colors again to that very last scene, where she's burying the two sabers, and she's, in all white once again. So I always thought that was interesting and highly symbolic of, that, hey, this is Axis versus allies. It's good guys versus bad guys. And I think that's what audiences really like, is in a world where in the military side, things are much more messy. You don't have that clear good versus evil, good guys versus bad guys. A multipolar world means that there's a lot more perspectives than just good and evil. So it's nice to be able to go to a movie and watch a movie where it is good versus evil. And it's a much more clearly delineated thing.
I mean, that might also connect with the time as they were made as well, isn't it? In that when Star Wars Empire Strikes Back were made, it was when we were making in terms of World War II films, we were doing the kind of the Where Eagles Dare and Kelly's Heroes, and we were the good guys. And then by the time the prequels are being made, maybe the Iraq War, things are a little bit more complicated about who the goodies and the baddies are. So we have to be a bit more obscure in that as well. So I'm conscious of the fact there's three people we haven't brought into the conversation yet. So we'll all go around and say a few words, then we can kind of open up and make it. So Jess, I'll bring you in, because you did some little, you were the SWAT, and you did some study on what George Lucas's background was. So share with us what you found out about him. And good evening, by the way, because you joined us late because of technical problems. So you're muted. Hang on. Still can't hear you.
Unmute. There we go.
There we go.
Basically, I found this book in the library about like George Lucas alive, and I thought, what better, for this talk and everything like that. And apart from his influences, like directors like the Akira Kurosawa and that kind of film, although not World War II, he took a lot from that. But during film school itself, he took on the work, like he was friends with like David Lean, who did, Bridge on the River Kwai, and even filmed like 49th Parallel and No Cowards, This Happy Breed. And 49th Parallel I actually caught the other day, and it's an abandoned U-boat crew trying to work their way across Canada into US, and it's just, as I was watching it, I could see little bits of Star Wars in it, even though, completely different setting. And George Lucas, even when he met Spielberg, he got this new inspiration to go away from that. But these directors, or what would go on to be directors and producers of films, because they worked with military crews as well, they kind of brought that kind of military essence into his filming. And I thought that was very, very interesting. The fact that World War II not only seeped into the story of Star Wars, but also seeped into the person and the persons making Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And if Jack manages to join us again, and Jack was in Empire Strikes Back, he's got technical problems. I think he was a communications officer. He was a former Royal Marine. As I understand it, a lot of the stormtroopers, a lot of the extras in the early films were ex-military, they're ex-service, and they treated it when they filmed it as a war film set in space. That's how they went into it. And if he does come back in, it'd be lovely to hear how they were kind of briefed on that. Because It is a war film in space. I mean, Rogue One, I would maintain, is a completely World War II film that just happens to be in the Star Wars universe. That is standard commando mission behind the lines, and that's it. Take out the lightsabers, take out everything else. It's just that so you know. But we've got two more people to bring in before we can go round again. So let's bring in Angry Staff Officer, well known for his blogs and writing about Star Wars and other things. Yeah, what's your feeling about the whole inspiration of the military to the Star Wars universe?
Yeah, no. First of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. I'm already learning a lot as it is. And I got to say, with so many British accents on here, I'm feeling a little bit surrounded by the Empire. So that's why I have my backdrop is for safety. I figured, you guys would see the AT-AT and I'd be safe from any type of retaliations. But no, I remember, we've all sort of have the bits of remembering as a kid, seeing the X-Wings peeling over, of course, is that iconic moment. Sometimes I get it confused with Battle of Britain in my mind. And then of course the trenches on Hoth, played that for hours out in the backyard. But you really get this idea of World War II Star Wars. Yeah, I did it. Star Wars on a grand scale as World War II, which is funny because Lucas is writing, sort of trying to show, especially by Return of the Jedi, he's kind of like being like, hey, this was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, good versus evil. Here, in present day, as he was writing and as it was being developed, there was a war going on. It was the Vietnam conflict. And, he's very sort of hammer over the head by Return of the Jedi, like, hey, look at these people with terrible technology kicking your ass. Boy, you should really feel bad about things. America, see yourself. And America's like, oh no, we see ourselves in the Ewoks. and it's just funny to see where you have it's all this World War II iconography, which is World War II being the good war, but as good as any type of war can be, but World War II being this good war, kind of throwing some shade towards this this bad war in Vietnam, or whatever all this quagmire is that we've gotten into Vietnam. And you get this idea, especially with the Rebel Alliance. One of the things that I've liked through Rogue One and even some of the animated stuff, we're not going to touch on it, but really hitting, when you watch it, you think, the Rebel Alliance, you're thinking the Allies, right? You're thinking, the World War II Allies, and then especially Rogue One, as you so pointed out, is just this phenomenal World War II commando film. But you actually begin to see the Alliance for what it is, and the Alliance is not the this great stand of major powers. It's more along the lines of any civil war, you figure out who your rebellion is. Like, you look at Syria, and it's this whole conglomeration of groups that, but for a civil war, are not going to have anything to do with each other. And so that's why I love these moments of this it's this real world push back and forth of ideologies set inside this World War II universe. And so that's kind of what I see when I look at how do we perceive Star Wars and World War II together.
No, it all makes sense. Well, let's bring in Zaina, because she's been waiting patiently to talk, and you teach military history. You're also a massive geek as well. So where does your story of connection with Star Wars come from? When did you first see it, and when did you kind of notice the World War II connections yourself?
I actually am only 3 weeks older than Star Wars. I was born before the original movie released, and Empire was my first movie in theaters. Jedi was my second movie in theaters. I also grown up with these movies. As a military historian, I actually focus not on the battles, but on the social aspect. Specifically, I study military masculinity and femininity, and there's so much there. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is how the gender politics of the 70s and the 80s, when the original trilogy was made, affect our perception of what World War II was like, because the connections are quite clear. I mean, almost right away, I recognized that the fighting that I was seeing in Star Wars was like the war movies I could see on TV on Saturdays. You know, in the middle of the afternoon, they put on the old war movies, and I could see that it was the same thing, even 10, 11 years old. And if we understand Star Wars as a representation of World War II, the big thing for me that's missing is all of the women in support roles. You know, as a person who studies women in the military, specifically the American women in World War II, I look for them in these movies. And I rewatched the trilogy, the original trilogy, to prepare, and I don't see a woman in a support role until Empire Strikes Back. There's one other woman who's evacuated with Princess Leia at the beginning in Hoth. And then there are a few women scattered throughout Return of the Jedi, but only Mon Mothma gets a name. And yet women played such an important role in the American military, in the British military, in the French resistance. They are vital to the success of the war. And I find it very interesting that now with the sequel trilogy that just wrapped up, a lot of fanboys, if you will, online, a lot of these kind of vocal and angry fans who are upset that we didn't get a complete retread of the original trilogy, are upset that we are forcing diversity. And I kind of want to throw my bookshelf at them. Because we're not forcing diversity. What we're doing is correcting an error from the 1970s, when people didn't even think that Princess Leia would wear a bra. You know, like there's a lot of baloney, we'll say, baked into the original trilogy that we have to spend a lot of time unpicking to really get a decent representation. To jump to the sequel trilogy, one thing I appreciated in the middle one, The Last Jedi, is the middle one called The Last Jedi? Yes. They have in that opening sequence, that great bomber battle, a lot of those pilots were women. And there were women pilots in the original Star Wars trilogy that got edited out. And I am pleased as a fan to see them back, and pleased as a historian to see them back. If we're talking World War II, yes, there are women who are flying planes for the Allies. Let's talk about that. It's both hard and exciting for me to kind of pick apart and kind of go after the Star Wars movies for their lack of representation. But I think that we really have to, especially considering that the Empire are space Nazis. That's what they are. The First Order in the new trilogy also, well, they're not space Nazis, they're space neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
And we have to get in there and say they are white supremacist, they are genocidal, that's who they're based on. And so we have to bring that in if we're going to understand this in a deeper fashion.
That's a very good point, and I'm glad you mentioned the bomber run in the modern trilogy, because that's I'll bring in Alan and Matt, because Matt's the aviation guy. To me, that's where they missed having people who actually understood World War II history, who had been involved in the 70s and 80s of the film, because if you know anything about the bombing of Germany, they didn't fly painfully slowly at 5 miles an hour over Germany. They went as fast as they fucking well could and got out of the other side. But that sequence, it's a great sequence, by the way, when Rose's sister ends up having to go down and kick which is a copy of the scenes in numerous war films. Even Dr. Strangelove has a scene at the end of him having to go down and kick the hatches open. But that's where they kind of lost their connection with the World War II history, because there probably wasn't anyone involved in the making of them who'd actually understood military history. So we've kind of been around. Everybody's had a go. We're going to kind of bring some structure to this. So let's go through some of the. We're going to discuss equipment. We're going to discuss tactics. We're going to look at the imagery. So let's talk, as we talk about the bombing, let's start with tactics and strategy. Where can we see World War II connections in any of the trilogies, any of the 9 films? Where are some obvious things that are clearly lifted from World War II? Alan, I know you've got, let's do your Dunkirk thing, because I think that we've been chatting on Twitter the last couple of weeks preparing for this, and we've had some good conversations. So Alan, you know, you've written about the British people in the 1940s, and you know, you've famous in your last book, you referenced the Shire folk of Lord of the Rings, but you know, your Dunkirk analogy I think is interesting. So start us off with that one.
Okay. Well, yeah. So Star Wars, that starts with Dunkirk. I guess that's the simplest way to put it. In my view, anyway. I can torture this analogy even further, because I think that you could argue that the two droids are Sir Alan Brooke and Sir Ronald Adam as well, escaping from the beaches, and they then go to Tatooine and take their reforms of the British Army, which they then will use to win the war. But there's a point at which I think even I think this starts to collapse. But it does strike me that the start of the film is actually, I mean, I can connect it with a bigger point here, which is that I think one of the things that links Star Wars with Tolkien actually is that there's this kind of tension about technology. One of the themes, I think, of both of the Lord of the Rings and of Star Wars is this sort of anti-technology bent, in that the more you rely on technology, the more you succumb to hubris and are destined to to succumb to your own defeat. So I mean, Darth Vader actually gets the best line, when he says, "Don't become too proud of this technological terror," which in some ways is kind of the motto of, or one of the mottos of the whole first trilogy, certainly. And as I say, Lord of the Rings is very much down on this idea. So I mean, you see, I think in Star Wars also the what was already been mentioned about the Vietnam kind of analogy as well. I think Lucas was very interested in this idea of low technology societies fighting high technology societies, and the Ewok battle is partly about the idea that very big machines are not necessarily going to win you the battle, and in some ways that's kind of certainly the traditional way in which we've tended to think about the battle against Germany, which is that they had the best stuff. They had the biggest tanks. They had the all of the kit, and we won for reasons which were aside from that. We even though we actually had inferior kit, we nonetheless won. Now that's I hasten to add, that's not actually in reality an argument that bears much weight, but it's certainly one of the mythical ways, I think, in which the war is understood. You certainly get the feeling that the Empire's procurement officer was an ancestor of or descendant of Albert Speer, because the Empire's solution to everything is always, let's just build a bigger one. So they keep building out these damn Death Stars, don't they? Even though that they each of them fails each time, but the answer to that is, let's just get a Death Star that's 3 times as big. I mean, it reminds me of the Mouse, the tank at the end of the war. It's like, well, the solution here is to build a tank that's just 5 times bigger than all the other ones. And I think one of the themes is, rightly or wrongly in terms of the history, is that that relying on technology like that is not necessarily going to win you the conflict. That was an extremely rambling answer that departed.
No, it's absolutely fine. And this is the thing. When we think again about Star Wars being made in '76, and this is only 7 years after Battle of Britain came out, that film there, which was right in the era when it was the plucky few, the underdog, defeating the superior Luftwaffe, which we now realize is bollocks. We now realize the RAF in 1939-40 was very, very prepared for the Luftwaffe. We had advantage of, we were playing at home, we had time, and so this idea that the Luftwaffe were doomed against us, we know that now. But are we going to look at the Star Wars universe in the same kind of way? I don't know. But the themes of the kit and the equipment, I think, are fascinating. Of course, we do have to address the fact that when they're making the first film, it was on a ridiculously tiny budget, and they're throwing the World War II gear in it because that's all they had. That's why it ended up being Lewis guns, FG-42s, and the bandoliers, the Jawas wearing all that kind of stuff, because it was sitting around in prop houses, hadn't been used. Those bandoliers were the same kind of ones you see in the Sudan kind of epics, the 4 feathers and stuff. They've probably been sitting in prop houses for 20 years, not being used. But of course, now they've continued the World War II imagery completely, because they've made their commitment to it. They've got to carry on with that same imagery. So now you see in the Mandalorian, you see 37 Academy equipment, you see Cara Dune's rifle is part Bren gun, part MG34 with the saddle drums. Now clearly now they can design whatever the hell they want for the Mandalorian because they can just throw Disney's money at it. The fact they've chosen again to use a World War II weapon, I think, is revealing of their commitment to keeping World War II imagery there for whatever reason, sort of asking Disney and the current art directors why they did that. And I did invite a few of them on the show, but they're obviously a bit busy doing all their 15 billion series they're moving now. But they've obviously consciously chosen to carry on this World War II imagery, which I think is really fascinating. So who wants to start with another? Alan did his Dunkirk there. Who wants to bring another big World War II that we can see in Star Wars? Who's going to go next? So I'm gonna bring staffers in. Come on, let's bring in our resident blogger there. So when you're watching any of the films now, when is the bit you go, bloody hell, that's just World War II? Name one of the things that cries out as being World War II to you.
Well, I mean, it's not the German blitz across the armored blitz across France, but my backdrop pretty well says, hey, this is what happens if you take an underfunded Western front that hasn't quite developed the concept of defense in depth, as the French had by 1916, 17, and the British and the rest of the Entente. I mean, everyone was doing defense in depth because it's the only way you survive mass artillery. But no, the thing that screams sort of, hey, look, we're going to deploy armor against entrenched infantry to see what happens. Armor wins. Hey, look, it's World War II, which is, I mean, that's sort of the thing that the trope that's out there was that World War I was essentially a battle of machine guns and artillery against infantry in the open. And then someone gets this idea of, hey, we're going to have a tank and go through all the massive iterations of how to get the thing not to break down or catch on fire, or all the other things that happen with tanks, and so you get this moment of the armor being victorious on the battlefield against an entrenched enemy, even though the entrenched enemy violated similarly like every single principle of combat that any BEF, CEF, or AEF soldier would have known immediately, from World War I, which is flanking fire is the best kind of fire. You bring your air support in to sweep across the sides of the enemy formation, not right down where their own weapon system, can only point like a 15-degree right and left. You actually have a defense in depth, and there's this thing called artillery. That's I think probably one of my biggest pet peeves in the Star Wars universe is that the only indirect, artillery has been the dominant arm. And I'm sorry, air people. I apologize to all of my air comrades out there who say that, air power wins wars. But clearly the air support on Hoth was definitely lacking. But artillery has been historically the predominant arm on the battlefield, on the ground war. And it's just not in existence until Return of the Jedi, if we're talking original trilogy. And then it's used by the Ewoks. And as I pointed out in writing, they're the only ones who actually do what we would call technically combined arms warfare. They're actually fighting on the ground with indirect fire, coordinating obstacles with direct and indirect fires, and a sort of close air support with weird gliders. The Battle of Hoth,
and engineers.
Yeah. Well,
You've just managed to convince me that having the Ewoks in the trilogy is a really good idea, because I'd never thought about it from that point of view. But actually, you're absolutely right, aren't you? They are the ones that show the most variety of weapon systems, for want of a better word. And that's just blown my mind.
It's gonna give you a headache for a long time. And I'm sorry to have to do that, but unfortunately, they are the only ones who can do that.
Apparently there's a mortar in the last 1 or 2 episodes of season 2 of The Mandalorian. I haven't caught up with season 2 yet because I don't have Disney Plus, but There is a mortar.
There's a mortar
Apparently
and a machine gun, and they actually
Okay.
use fire and maneuver, and it's amazing.
So it has taken however many decades and however many films and series to actually get to the point where they're using indirect fire. But that is interesting. So, someone who else wants something World War II that we haven't thought of? I mean, we discussed the fact there's a dam, but okay, Karen wants to say something. So let's bring in.
Okay, so first and foremost on Hoth, there's definitely air power, because how did they get off of Hoth? Transportation wins. Don't mess with the loggies. But I think, so for me, the visual imagery, so obviously, as Sapper pointed out, early in World War II, everything in World War II is a ground fight. It's very, very early on in air power and aviation, and air power wasn't really used in World War I the way it was in World War II. We just hadn't matured the technology, and we hadn't matured the tactics. But by the time we got to World War II, you've seen the very distinct visuals of, you've got the overlapping bomber formations with the overlapping fighter formations. We've come up to the point where we've got tactics of they can shoot within the formations. And because of the way everything is overlocked and interlinked, we're not shooting down our own fighters. And I think, to me, one of the things that makes me think World War II type air power across the original trilogy is that they are showing the fighter formations kind of in their very close formations, which is, if you think about now with the modern fighters, just normal real world modern fighters, they don't have to be that close. I mean, we're talking they're scattered all across the air and still in a formation, but spread very, very widely. Now, of course, some of that you can go back and go, yeah, well, if I spread X-wings across the entire screen at 100-mile intervals, there could be a little teeny tiny dot on my movie screen. So obviously, I'm gonna group them closer together for the visuals. But to me, it seems ludicrous that I would have the advanced technology to be able to create spaceships and faster than light travel, and I'm still going to group them up that close together as a fighting formation. So the tactics part of it, I think, is out the window. Everybody knows that I think it's out the window for this, but that visual is just so reminiscent of everything you see for the air power that we utilized in World War II. That said, obviously, they didn't do a whole lot of consulting for the second movie in the third trilogy with that bombing run. That's just a disaster of physics. It would not work, and it's ludicrous that you would do that, stand off, 10,000 miles with a photon torpedo or something and shoot like that. Bombs don't work. But I do love that visual comes back to like your big belly bombers, and you're really looking down through the giant racks of bombs because, well, yes, the technology is just ridiculous. It's still a very cool visual. And as you touched on earlier, it's something that we know, and it's something that we can go back to, and it's something that brings us that reality of, yeah, the physics doesn't work. It's stupid movie physics, but I know what the visual is. And now in my brain, I can link the two, and I've got that connection there. So that's kind of my favorite imagery, I think, when it comes to the air power parts of the third set of trilogies.
I mean, when we think about it, World War II, though, we had at any one time in World War II, there were all types of levels of sophistications of battles going on. You've got stuff going in the Burmese jungle that was basically the same tactics they've been using hundreds of years ago. People walking on foot with mules, attacking each other at close quarters with handheld weapons. And you've got the technology of bombing Germany. And the Star Wars universe, which we don't really know how big it's really supposed to be, but clearly it's bigger than one planet. It does make sense that there will be different levels of technology and different types of warfare taking place concurrently because of the spread of the technologies. But the tactical side of things is fascinating. So you've famously written about the fact that the strategy, and there's no logistics shown, there's no support staff. They all seem to know what they're doing very quickly. There's no who prepares all the briefings, who prepares the air intelligence, who does all the logistics runs, and also promotion.
Right. Who is my space staff?
Private to general very quickly, don't you? I mean, Finn is made a general in the last film. He was a nobody. He's a deserted stormtrooper, and boom, suddenly he's a general. Do they not have lieutenants, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels in the alliance? It seems to.
No, I don't think they do. Well, look at Han too. I mean, Han and Lando both didn't both end up as generals by the end? You got General Calrissian, and I mean, he went from, hey, I'm the mayor, I'm the governor of Cloud City, to all of a sudden I'm a general. I've seen that go the other way, where you're some form of general officer and then you go run for politics, but that's a whole other discussion we probably won't get into here.
Quite possibly, no. So I mean, so let's go around again. I mean, I knew this conversation was going to be very difficult to manage, and I'm trying to do my best to moderate it. There's so many things we can talk about and different ideas and things, but let's just kind of go free fall with it now. And I'm gonna just bring in Jess now because she's been sitting there waiting for sweetly. And you know, you've hung around. I've met you in Normandy. I've met you at Chalk Valley last year. You've been to Bastogne. You've been places there, and yeah, but Bastogne and Hoth, I think, definitely have some kind of connection, don't they? When you're standing in the Bastogne or Normandy, you can definitely see some of that kind of imagery they use in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I mean, is Endor Bastogne? I don't know. I mean,
yeah. Well, personally, like after like rewatching the original trilogy, I noticed this years ago, but never actually said anything. It didn't come up in conversation. But the episode 4 is everything about it is predominantly like not exactly the phony war, but like the first stages of war that we know and learn about. You know, there's Luke on a planet. The war's going on, and everybody knows it is, but it's not come home yet. So no, not everybody is eager to join and everything like that. And then he gets, you know, as with a lot of other young guys at that age, you know, in that time as well, they wanted to volunteer and be called up to fight. And so they did. Episode 5, where you've got the, I find it's a bit like more like the Eastern Front, and the uniforms say that, you know, all covered in white and obviously Hoth and everything like that. And then episode 6, I love because it kind of, obviously after VE Day, it focused more on Japan, and that was the Japanese warfare, like guerrilla warfare in the jungle and stuff like that. And I've made that connection and I've mentioned it to people, but they've kind of looked at me in a very weird way. I've just wondered if anybody else has made that kind of connection.
I think we all have here. Certainly, speaking of myself, I think I've been seeing World War II stuff in Star Wars for as long as I've been seeing the films. And whether I'm making up those connections, I don't know. I mean, I will tell you because I'll just do my favorite story about Star Wars. And as those who don't know, I'm a Normandy tour guide in a normal year. And I've stood at Point du Hoc how many hundreds of times and looked at that domed observation bunker there with the slot there underneath it. And Alan Tompkins, who passed away this year, who was the art director of Empire Strikes Back, he designed the Snowspeeder, he designed the droid, the droid. I was talking to him once, and we were talking about the Death Star. Now, he didn't work on Star Wars. He didn't start till Empire Strikes Back, but he knew the people who worked on Star Wars. And when they had the model of the first Death Star, the model there, it just didn't look right. They couldn't determine which way up. We want to make it look like it's got a clear right way up and the wrong way up. And one of the guys on the film in the model making department had been in one of the Royal Naval ships on D-Day in Normandy off the shore of Point du Hoc, and he'd spent most of his day staring through binoculars at Point du Hoc and kept seeing that observation bunker that's a dome, the semicircular shape that now, when you see it today, has a big bomb crater, impact, a naval shell impact on it that made a kind of a concave circle. And he mentioned that to the model makers, and they added the concave circle in the Death Star that is the bit the ray comes out of. And according to Alan, that was copied from the observation bunker in Normandy that this guy was facing at. So there's a direct little story there that I was told by Alan of how Normandy and D-Day got involved in the Star Wars universe in the creation of the Death Star. And I've not seen that one written down anywhere. My other favorite story, it's not really to do with World War II, but it is. I'm just going to tell it because it's my show, and I'm going to tell it. And what the hell, is Alan Tompkins again. He designed the Snowspeeder, and this is how people take it very seriously. He got a letter once from a guy in Australia, and not just a letter, it was a full kind of scientific report. This guy in Australia had built a Snowspeeder to like 1/6 side. This thing was like 8 foot long or something, and he took it to some wind tunnel in Melbourne or Perth, wherever it was. And he did tests on it, and he wrote to Alan Tompkins and told Alan that at speeds beyond whatever it was, Mach 2, the wing would fall off or something. It's not aeronautically sound beyond a certain speed. How can you explain that? Why did you design something that was aeronautically impossible? Alan Tompkins wrote back and said, you're basing your data on the fact that gravity is the same in the planets we're writing about as it is in the Star Wars universe, and you don't know how different the gravity may be there. And by the way, B, he said, It just had to look cool, and we didn't care whether it actually had to fire or not because it was a fucking model. And that's what he wrote back to the guy on the show. So they're my two stories. I would have had Alan on the show had he not passed away this year, because Alan told me more about Star Wars than I knew. And you know, he was a guy who'd grown up, born in 1939, lived through the Blitz, was there, and he took a lot of his World War II knowledge into the designing of the art department, and a lot of his friends. He worked on Bridge Too Far and The Keep and lots of other war films as well. So that's just a couple of stories there to randomly keep things
Lucas
going.
made a point of not having everything prim and pristine. He wanted things to look worn, so he did it, and it was the kind of, you know, as with the military, what they did, you know, if something needed fixing and it's the military, you didn't always get what you needed. So they just kind of botched it and made it up as they went along. And sometimes, and basically Lucas wanted to put that in to Star Wars as well.
Yeah.
Like, especially with like David Lean and stuff like that. And one thing I did want to say, one of my favorite kind of bits of Star Wars is actually the bit where Luke's going, we were talking about the technology and why didn't they use more technology to get the spot on target and everything. But what the Dambusters did, just using two spotlights, that when it got down to the right height, they became one spotlight. And the really rustic kind of simple, it was two bits of wood on a little plane, and that just a guy going along, and it's like, yeah, they line up with the wood, drop, like they line up with the pillars of the dam, drop the bomb now. And it's that kind of simplicity that I love. And obviously at the end, Luke doesn't use the computer because he knows he doesn't have to, because he has the force and belief in himself, which I'm sure that a lot of pilots probably thought and hoped that they did. Well,
that comes down to the theme we started earlier about this idea of the technologically challenged allies against the technologically superior empire, and the fact that it kind of works, that we have turrets on our ships that don't kind of look like they're up to date, but that's perhaps all we had. That's representing the alliance is putting together things from all over the place to make a stand against this tyrannical empire that has established itself. So
Lucas is trying to say that as well. He's like, Star Wars is essentially about Vietnam, he said, and he like kind of, it was basically underlying Star Wars is his kind of thoughts about Vietnam. Well, I know we're on World War II and stuff like that, but it was deep-seated in Lucas's thoughts when he was making Star Wars about, you know, why is Vietnam, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. So let's bring in Zaina now and talk about because I like your theme about the representation of females has obviously changed and improved over the series, because we understand, I mean, I get it on you know, we had the discussions like about 1917 and things, and why aren't there more women in the front line in World War I? But you can't retroactively put women back into places in history where they weren't. You can't suddenly have battalions of female British infantry in World War I in 1916. But the Star Wars universe, the point is they can do what the hell they want with that, because it's their own universe. So if they wanted to have entire,
you know?
Yeah, so let's talk about how that has progressed over the years, and the good things and the bad things. And famously, Leia said that she wasn't allowed to wear a bra, and you know, there are no bras in space, and this, that, and the other, and the gold bikini issue, for example, which, I mean, I remember that very, very keenly. I was 14 when Return of the Jedi came out, so I'm afraid that was one of those defining moments in my 14-year-old boy. But you know, I look at it now and I think, oh, that's a little bit unnecessary, you know. But Zane, let's bring in and talk about that, and where can as we've got so many Star Wars things coming up in the future, where can they go to make things better and more realistic, and should they, I suppose?
Well, to start from your last comment, yeah, they should. Because the world that we live in is incredibly diverse. There are people of all kinds of different skin tones and languages and religious belief and genders of all kinds, and that is just humanity. And they're playing in a galaxy far, far away with all kinds of possible alien species, and they've only really occasionally even done aliens that aren't humanoid. So I would really like to see them kind of explore the vast possibility of what life can be. I want to get back to your point about we can't put people where they weren't. My issue is they were there and they're being actively removed or they're being ignored. And I'm not saying put women where there weren't. I'm saying put women where they were. They were there. They were an active part of all of these events, all of these different groups. No, a lot of women were not on the front line. But if you want to talk women who fought in World War II, let's talk about the Soviet Union. Let's talk about the Soviet Union in World War I, or rather Imperial Russia in World War I. They did start putting together women's units. Let's talk about the Night Witches. Let's talk about the WASP. Let's talk about the Wrens. Let's talk about the Land Army. Because to get back to KR's point, without logistics, you have no military. Like, this is my biggest quibble and complaint about Star Wars is the travel times are ridiculously short. They're in space. It should take a lot longer to get where they're going. And so you have to be concerned about how you're getting your bullets or your energy source or your shoes to your people who are on Hoth, I think that there is room, especially going forward in the Star Wars universe, to talk about things that aren't as, sexy as a big battle, but are vitally important. And you can find really compelling and fascinating stories that get beyond the standard good versus evil, pointing weapons at each other, bang, bang, it's a battle. Like, we can go beyond that. It's not to say it's not interesting. Like, what we have is interesting. What we have is fun, but we can do so much more. And I think that there's room also to kind of talk about what we do see in the original trilogy, the new trilogies. In particular, I do want to point out that they make a really good effort to show the non-support role through Leia, Leia being a double agent, member of the Imperial Senate, spying for the rebellion. And this really gets back to the women's roles in both the French resistance. And there are a lot of women who worked as spies for the British military. And this isn't even getting into Bletchley Park and the code breakers. So I think that there are stories that we can tell that we've already started to see being told. Now, I have not yet watched The Mandalorian, so I don't know what that's involved, but I do know that it's not the main Skywalker saga. And I think that if future stories get away from the Skywalkers and get into the people who are caught up in the Skywalker's orbit, if you will, I think that there's a lot of room there for some really interesting stories. Women were there. Yeah. We're not inserting where they weren't. We are telling you that they were there and they were important because we're talking total war in War II. We're talking turning the entire economy, the entire society to getting this war, to getting these war aims accomplished. One thing that I do like to argue in the context of actual World War II, not space World War II, but in actual World War, one of the Nazis' biggest failings was not utilizing their women because they saw them so much as breeding only and didn't tap into the resources that they had among their population of women. This is not to say that the other allies were like super great at it. Certainly, there was a lot more room for women to take over roles in the military in both the British and the US Army, but they did take a lot more steps than the German military was willing to do. And I think that that's something that is important to understand and to think about, especially when watching these kind of rather simplified narratives about World War II that focus in on the heroic cis straight white man, take one little here.
To elaborate on your point about they don't show much downtime in the universe. I mean, when you think, the whole point of this, we started about the World War II movies, and a lot of World War II movies have the training scenes. Now, I know in the Star Wars universe, we have the Jedi training, but that is obviously for only a handful of people within the universe. I wonder with the new Rogue Squadron series they're going to be doing, whether they're going to be showing more downtime. Because when you think about those classic movies like Flat Top and the bridges at Toko Ri and those kind of naval and air force epic, fighter squadron, even Memphis Belle, you do see the training, you do see the practice. There's no practice except Jedis in the Star Wars universe. You don't get any even The Dirty Dozen, one of my favorite guilty pleasure movies. The action the actual mission isn't until the last third of the film. You have all the training, you have all the build up, you have becoming the obstacle course, the build up, the physical fitness. There's none of that in the Star Wars universe. Everybody seems to be proficient at their job immediately. They go out and do it, and as they go to private to general. So maybe there's scope to show more of how the Rebel Alliance train their fighters. How do they get taught? And if you can imagine, I'll bring Alan in a minute as well, because he's another military than Matt. In World War II, the British Army only had to learn how to fight against one species. If you're teaching a Rebel Alliance, you're talking about a whole variety of species and technologies that could be coming at you with all sorts of weaponry. So there's none of that shown at all, not of that in any way at all. So Matt, I'm going to bring you in now, Matt, because you haven't spoken for ages. And you're our aviation guy. So, yeah, how do you think X-Wing pilots get to be good at what they're doing? Where do they train? Is there any hint of that? I haven't read any of the kind of the wider universe stuff. Have you done any of that? Do you discover any kind of training?
It was a great disappointment to me after many years of watching Star Wars that I wouldn't be able to just jump in a Spitfire and be able to be a badass fighter pilot. But there's something special about Luke, and he is the hero. So jumping from a speeder into the most advanced fighter in the universe is probably a thing. But there's not really a lot, because I find the training fascinating. So the amount of losses within the training schools, the Commonwealth training scheme. There's in Canada we have the memorial for all the pilots who were killed in training. And it's interesting that's, you can call it a trope, that the training montage isn't it really in any of these movies. I think the sort of the closest I think any of the films has come to talk about that wider logistical element is a throwaway line in The Last Jedi when Benicio del Toro's character is telling them the lie of the land about who actually makes money from war. Yeah, and it's the same companies producing all the ships, all the fighters. And I think that's in possibly the worst section of that movie. But it's still one of the most resonant, because behind all this, behind the good and evil, there's a whole bunch more people just, supplying stuff, but also making a whole lot of money out of this as well. But it's the hero's journey, isn't it? It's the Campbell-esque. Someone progresses on and on and on and levels up and becomes the hero. And for those of us probably on this show, seeing Luke go through the Rebel training school for flying X-Wing fighters would have been fascinating, him getting the notes out and things like that. But maybe he did an ATA pilot. They handed him a little book saying, right, here's your takeoff procedure. The enemy's that way. If you come back, there's a beer in it for you. That would have been equally interesting.
Well, doesn't the Red Leader just say, just before they're about to attack the Death Star, it's like, do you think you can manage this? And he's like, yeah, well, I'm all set, mate. So okay, go for it.
Well, and World War II was also where they started actually having checklists and relying on checklist discipline. So within the context of World War II, it might make sense that he would in fact just hop in the thing and go, and they'd be like, yeah, dude, you got it. Good luck, buddy. Have fun.
I mean, that's one thing that's never touched on, is exactly how many X-Wings and how many fighters they are in existence. We know in World War II, because we're always being told about that we're building X number of Spitfires. We're always, at various points in the war, we and the Germans have either got too many pilots, not enough aircraft, or too many aircraft, not enough pilots. There's no mention of that in the Star Wars universe at all, are there? What you said there, Matt, about the sequence on the planet in film number 8, I thought was interesting. I didn't like that part of the film. But what I did like about it was the fact they were showing a planet where the war was irrelevant. Life was going on. And we do forget with World War II, there are countries like Spain and Portugal and some of South America and Africa, I suppose, where the war is not really affected. Life is going on as it was before the war, and life is going to go on after the war in a similar way. So that's something that the Star Wars universe, I think, should address. And also, as well, when we think about the old World War II movies, and it's one of the things I've talked about with Guy Walters and that, we have this image from the escape films. Everybody in Colditz and Stalag Luft 3 and all those prisoner of war camps was trying to escape every minute of every day. And we forget that most of those camps were full of people who felt they'd done their job. They were being fed meager rations and they just wanted to sit out the war and wait until liberation. And I think we need to see more of the Star Wars universe, which the Mandalorian, I think, has done, that there's systems going on that aren't involved in a struggle of good and evil, because they don't give a shit about what's good and evil. They're just trying to do what it is. They farm their moisture, grow their crops, do whatever it is, sell their junk, and they don't give a shit about what's happening on a wider level. So that is something that the Star Wars universe, I think, copies some of the tropes and the mistakes from the film. So let's bring Staffer in again. So as a serving military, what annoys serving military about the Star Wars films in terms of tactics and the military side of things? What do they all go, oh God, here we go again? There must be things that are very annoying.
I mean, stormtrooper marksmanship has to lead the way. I mean, it's a sort of how many shots can you take before you hit something? And I've written about it a little bit sort of satirically through sort of some of my stormtrooper after action reviews or briefings, talking about, hey, we range time got canceled again because, we had to go deal with some other thing that just blew up. And, we're not doing actually many preventative maintenance checks on our AT-ATs. Somehow they all just magically work. Everything just gets circle X'd instead of deadlined. I think it's the lack of any, we've hit on this before. It's like, I like to say, logistics is literally a Jedi hand wave in the Star Wars universe. It's just, all of your vehicles are fully operational. All of your supplies have made it. No one is at sick call. I mean, these are things that realistically, as a commander, you're looking at it, you're like, all right, what if my stuff is broken? What training have we not conducted, and who's not here because they're on? No stormtrooper has ever taken leave, as far as I can tell. In addition to their poor marksmanship, one of the things that's really fascinating from a military standpoint, looking at how the military world impacts what happens on screen. So in the original trilogy, all your stormtroopers are sort of, they're carrying their weapons sort of at this low ready position. They're running along and they're kind of shooting that way too. Once you get into the sequels, all of a sudden they're running in like this. They're actually, they're ready to go. And then you see things like extra mag pouches. Did these blasters need magazines? There's optics on the blast. Like the First Order has basically gone like full global war on terror, and like every single stormtrooper is like just kitted himself out to the utmost, taking all those credits and spending them at some really crappy PX somewhere, just buying all of this stuff to try to make himself shoot a little bit straighter, again to no avail. But that's,
it could be that they're only paid in stormtrooper credits and they can only spend them at PXs and NAFIs, and the only things to buy are holsters and special gear and sights you don't need, because what they really want to buy, pornography and food, they can't buy that. I don't know. So perhaps that's why they're buying more shit. It's literally the only stuff they're allowed to buy.
They can't get booze. I mean, you don't see there are no drunk stormtroopers.
No,
it's just ridiculous.
Of course there are. They're the ones that can't shoot.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up a point there. It's a good point there, Staff. It's about simply acclimatization. Now, I did my World War II comics shows a few weeks ago, and one of the things that was coming up with one of the writers is that he was writing one of his friends was writing one of the commando books in the 60s, and it was talking about the whatever it was, the British Army over in Burma, and his grandfather or something came in, and his grandfather was a I've just put myself on the wrong view. I'll go back there. His grandfather came in and said, "What are you doing, son?" I said, "I'm writing a commando book set in Burma." And he said, "Is the first 3 quarters of the story you sitting on the toilet and shitting yourself for 2 months? Because that's all of us did before we get into anything combat, is get acclimatized to the fact you spent the first 2 months shitting yourself." And that's something that no stormtrooper or ally or resistance ever seems to have any problem adapting to the new planet, doing that. Now, surely, and this is where you serving guys can go, when you go on deployment to Iraq or Afghanistan, there are jabs, there are things that there's issues about don't drink this water, put that water for purification in there. There's no mention of that in the Star Wars universe at all. They're just hopping from planet to planet and everything's fine. Their arms must be riddled with all the, unless there's some kind of force, you are all now protected with the, I don't know, but that's something that is never established. The fact they hop from planet to planet and no jabs, no medical briefing. No, the fact the only medical staff are droids, aren't they? Are there any human medical?
All you have are the medical ships with droids. But that you bring me to a great point. Let's be honest, all of us who have traveled to battlefields, or trenches or bunkers or anything like that, if you don't look around and go, where are the toilets? How did they relieve themselves? That's sort of my benchmark of, have you been studying this for way too long? Because I've got one friend who engaged Taliban that came through the wire with an RPG from inside a porta-john. It ripped the door off. Another friend who during Desert Storm was taking mortar rounds while he was behind a bush, relieving himself, and sort of had to react to that. So this is a constant of warfare of, the human frame has to relieve itself. At no point do you ever learn, how do stormtroopers poop? But that is enough of the scatological, but that's honestly, we look at it that from a hygiene point of view, that's a really important thing.
This is, I think, it may be a silly part of the conversation, but I think it kind of needs to happen, is that what the Star Wars universe does is it takes all the exciting parts of warfare and ignores all the boring part of it, isn't it? Everybody knows exactly what they're doing, and they all know. When you see the last trilogy, the number of aircraft, I know, Kerry, you mentioned it earlier, you see in the screen at any one time. Air traffic control, for want of a better word, must be a nightmare in there, because but I know they're condensing it and they're putting it all on screen there, but there's ships of different speeds. They're moving at light speed. They're moving through meteor showers. You never have him. Sorry, he's late. He had to stop off because he had to go get damage repaired somewhere on something because he got lost on the way there. There's none of that logistical support.
But that's historically accurate, though, right? During World War II, we didn't really have air traffic control. We didn't have jet routes. That didn't come about until the Berlin airlift. All of that was post World War II, when they were doing the Berlin airlift afterwards. That's when they started creating those jet routes and building up the air logistics trains and really seeing that. So believe it or not, that would actually be historically accurate.
Although they had, of course, trained the formation flying, hadn't they? That comes back to training again. They had spent lots of hours just doing that. We'll bring Zaina in now as well. But it comes back to the fact they don't show how these people go from rookie pilots to veteran pilots immediately. But yeah, let's bring Zaina in.
Yeah, this is another place where we could have seen women, because U.S. and British armies, women were the ones who were doing the training on pilots, the link trainer, the ground-based training for night flying, all of that. All of those instructors were women. Air traffic controllers were women, the ones who kind of came up with, how do we handle all of these aircraft and how do we keep control of them? Those jobs were given to women. Radio operators were women. All of the communications. This goes back to the hello girls of World War I, those women who are fluent in French and English, and so can be the communication between the American front lines and the French headquarters. like, this is another place where we can bring them in. So yeah, it doesn't exist in the sense that we're talking about with air routes and things like that, but there are skilled people in the military that we could have said, hey, this is who is handling all of this. And I think this might also be why I noticed that one woman in Empire, because she's an air traffic controller, she's got X-wings on the X-wings, the planes, whatever, I think they're A-wings in Empire, whatever they are. She's got them up on her screen and she's directing them. And then she's grabbed and pulled out at the very, very end, which is also historically accurate. What gets me is we want to talk about historically accurate, and yet we don't want to talk about, we only want to talk about like the explosion-y stuff. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation talking about the behind the scenes stuff, because, you know, without porta-johns, you know, without knowing where people are going to go to the bathroom, we're not going to have the explosion-y story to tell, because everybody's going to be sick from dysentery because we don't have a latrine spot. So I think that we have a real opportunity to get back to the question you asked a while ago, to talk about stuff like that. But yeah, it's interesting what they kind of allied in the interest of telling a story. And I think that speaks to what we find compelling as a story, if that makes sense. Like, people, I mean, look at the success of the Marvel movies. We want to go see superheroes punch baddies and have things explode and have a real simple narrative. And I think that people glom on to World War II as this simple story, but it is so complex. There are so many moving parts. Even if we just want to talk about one branch of one state's military, even if we just want to talk, for example, the United States Marine Corps in World War II is a vast, vast topic. And we have this set of movies that are trying to replicate all of World War II. And I mean, how do you do that? And what do you lose in the process? I think that it's an interesting conversation to have, is what are we skipping over? And what are we deciding is the important story to tell?
I mean, this goes back to what we said right at the top of the show, is that we know about the Dambusters inspiring the attack sequence of the Death Star. We're saying that there's this World War II and Star Wars connection, but actually, is it the World War II movies and Star Wars connection that they copied more than they actually copied the real history? Because they repeated the same mistakes the war movies made, in that, like you said, all the movies about the US Marines are all about guys running up the Sound of Terror. There's nothing about the Royal Marine, the US Marines that are behind this. They're repeating the same mistakes the war films make, aren't they? In that, even the British war films, there's not much going on about kind of the cruel sea, I suppose, covers the merchant navy a little bit, and the supplies element, I suppose. But most of the classic war movies are combat, aren't they? So, Alan, we haven't. We'll bring in Alan now, because you're the resident military historian here again. So, this idea of the fact the movies copied the films more than the history. Are we onto something there? Do you think?
Yeah, well, the movies copy the myth, certainly, which is derived in part from cinema, and as well as other things. One of the things that actually occurred to me while I was sitting here was about the Rebel Alliance, and I was thinking about it and thinking about why do they have X-wings? I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the Rebel Alliance is that in one way it's supposed to be a kind of space version of the French resistance, or maybe Tito's partisans, so they are, on the one hand, they're these sort of beleaguered group who sort of have to take to the hills, metaphorically speaking, constantly. They're kind of hiding out in these little bases. They're hiding out on Yavin in the first film, and then they're hiding out on Hoth, and they're having to move around all the time. And yet they have all of this kit, which they have apparently manufactured themselves, which is very distinct from anything that the Empire has, and it's also just as good. I mean, an X-wing seems to be just as good as a TIE fighter, which then raises the question: well, where do they make all this stuff? Do they have an industrial base? Do they have there's sort of planets that are churning out X-wings? And presumably, if all this kit is just as good as anything that the Galactic Empire can produce, that says either that the Galactic Empire has a pretty lousy, system of producing equipment, or the rebels are able to tap into some kind of source of materiel, which you wonder why the Empire doesn't shut that down. I mean, I think the bigger point here is that there's the mythology of World War II, or one of the mythologies of World War II, is about resistance, and of course this is very famous and popularly celebrated in literature and cinema and so forth. And it's the idea of the resistance movements being able to take on the might of the Wehrmacht and so on. When of course we know in reality, resistance movements most of them were pretty ineffectual, very noble attempts, but on the whole not actually very successful at being able to resist the German occupying forces. Where they were successful to some extent, they relied very largely for materiel, either on stolen equipment or equipment that they had procured from their enemy, or from the Allies. So you think, for instance, about Tito's forces. I mean, the Yugoslav partisans are either knocking around with stolen MP40s and so on, or they're relying on stuff which is airdropped into them from the Allies. So why don't the Rebel Alliance have TIE fighters? Why don't they just steal a bunch of them and and use those instead? And I guess it's because, well, I mean, the film sort of wants to have it both ways, doesn't it? They want the rebels to be both the Allies and also buy into this kind of the panache and the kind of the cultural trope of being the beleaguered resistance too. But if I was the rebels, I wouldn't spend all this time building X-wings. I mean, just steal some of the Empire stuff. They don't seem to look after it very well anyway. I mean, it's pretty easy to. That's
a very good point, and I think that the chat going on about the fact that Rogue One is the first of the Star Wars films to establish there are different types of resistance. There are people who want a slightly different thing. They want the Empire gone, but they have different aspirations on it, which comes into the Yugoslavia in World War II thing perfectly, doesn't it? Tito, Chetniks, they have a different idea of what they want. They don't necessarily want the Nazis there, but they have very different ideas about that. But I guess the other thing we connected the kit. The Empire clearly has one guy or a couple of guys at top. There's the Emperor, there's Darth Vader, that's the idea of having to combat an empire where everything has to go through the man at the top. And to extend your point there, Alan, about the TIE fighters and what have you, is the reason perhaps the Empire doesn't use X-wings is because everything has to go through that single guy at the top, and that single guy at the top is clearly crazed. The Emperor in Star Wars is a mad, mystical, blah blah blah. He's not thinking logically. So all the staff officers below him probably present good ideas to him every day that he just goes, no, let's carry on with that. Whereas the Allies has much more of a, well, who's in charge here? Because no one wants to be the one to sort of to step up and say, I'm in supreme charge, because they've tried that and it doesn't work. So that's the interesting thing about how the two forces actually control themselves. The dictatorship versus the rabble.
Yeah.
So I was just waiting for one of the rebels to say something about the soft underbelly of the Empire and maybe
definitely
invading, going into the Balkans. But I love that in Rogue One, though, you get that great moment where they're all just arguing and you realize, and this is we were talking in the chat about why we all love, well, I can't say for all of us, many of us love Rogue One, because it shows that the true aspect of the alliance in World War II, where the movies show, obviously the Americans and the British and the French and the Russians, they all got along peachy and they were fine. And then as soon as you dive into the literature, you go, I can't believe that we won that one, because between the British and the Americans and the French, like, we argued so much about literally everything. I mean, Churchill was the only person who actually made Marshall swear in front of a whole bunch of other people, which, you know, if you can get George Marshall, the marble man, to actually lose his shit, you know, it's who, that's the, I think it's a good portrayal of the alliance, and the fact that it's amusing to me that the only way that something happens is that somebody just sort of, you know, breaks off and goes and does their own thing, does a commando raid, and that's where it's a little bit different from the actual history, where you go, all right, no, we're going to put our differences aside. We are going to, you know, everybody, you know, Monty, sit down, Patton, shut up. Adults are going to try to work this thing out, and we're going to get an overlord and a two-front situation, all that other thing. But I enjoyed that for the realism and the way that it breaks through the old World War II trope. Overall, we're all just good friends and good allies, and pushing on through the Cold War against those evil Soviets.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, and it also, we don't ever see, there is no Churchill, wrote FDR kind of figure. If there is one in the Rebel Alliance, we never see them, because the most we ever see are generals. Is that, I'm trying to think of anybody we see who is beyond. We obviously, in the prequel trilogy, we see senators and politicians, but that is done away with, isn't it, at the end of 3. So by the time we get to A New Hope, I mean, where is the Rebel Alliance HQ? Where is it? Is there one? That's got me thinking now. Is it an idea that is the central part of the Rebel Alliance, or is there some kind of home base? I mean, when we think of World War II, thankfully, apart from Pearl Harbor, the USA was never attacked. So we had that kind of central base and hub to work from, and then Britain, as famously, is have an aircraft carrier for the USA as well. But I do wonder how the Rebel Alliance manages to organize itself. Has anyone got any ideas of where the Rebel Alliance gets its orders from? Who's the top of the Rebel Alliance? Or being insane, not really. Hang on.
So, okay.
Yeah, we're there.
So I've been understanding just in the last few years, the Rebel Alliance is working much more as kind of a set of independent groups working together, because the only real leader that we see with any consistency is Leia. And in the original trilogy, she is a senator who's working with the rebellion, back to that double agent comment I made earlier. But by the time we get to the new trilogy, the sequel trilogy, she is General Organa. And she is in charge. But in the first trilogy, I think it's much more of a looser organization. In my rewatch, I realized that what they did was they deliberately led the Death Star to Yavin. So they didn't have to go find the Death Star, basically. They brought everything right into that base on Yavin, but they didn't evacuate the base on Yavin, which I was confused about. But it struck me that they were maybe willing to sacrifice that group, because any one person in that early rebellion isn't that important. Like they can continue without Princess Leia. That was the impression that I got by being willing to sacrifice the Yavin base to the Death Star in an attempt to take out. That tells me that they have many, many other cells that are just as active and just as powerful and capable. And we are just following the story of Leia's cell. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Well, it must make sense because of the number of ships that turn up at the end of number 9, isn't it? Where are the, because there's no explanation apart from the odd Easter eggs, the fact you see the Mandalorian ship in there and a couple other kind of universe. We don't know where, there's no explanation of where they've come from and who is on those ships, and are they from planets? Are they from systems? Are they individuals? There's no explanation of that. But the sheer volume of ships means that there is a lot of people who are behind the alliance that we have not heard their stories yet. So your idea of we're only following that one cell, if we're going to bring the World War II connection in, we've only been looking at France, we've only been looking at Yugoslavia, we've only been looking at Burma. We haven't been looking at a global effort. We've only been focusing on one aspect of it, which suggests there is plenty more scope to continue the expansion of the universe, the expansion of the stories, and yet it still have, because they're talking about going back to the old republic. I don't think they've even tapped into this one war yet. If they want to stick with the characters we know and have the occasional appearance of the characters, the Boba Fett, the Luke Skywalkers. There's enough they can elaborate on in this. They can go back to the period of A New Hope and show another campaign. In the sense, if we imagine The New Hope is in the ETO, there's a Pacific theater of operations happening at the same time, or vice versa. So there's no problem going back the same era. Maybe we will see someone who, as you say, is higher up than Leia. Maybe we will see the equivalent of a president or a prime minister or some kind of appointed. Because Yoda is a priest. He's a religious figure, isn't he? In a sense, he is not sort of.
You do have Mon Mothma, who's the de facto.
Yeah, she came up on YouTube as a conversation, but there's
no argument on the chat. That goes into a bit of detail.
Yeah, but there's no really explanation. I mean, I'm not familiar with the expanded universe of exactly where she fits into it in the bigger. I'm talking about just from the films. There's not much backstory to her, is there really? Now, there's interesting stuff there, this idea of where they could expand it on there. But we've got a bit serious now. Let's bring back to something a bit more trivial. Favorite bits of World War II equipment you've spotted in the universe that perhaps some of you haven't noticed. I mean, I like the 37 pattern large pack in The Mandalorian. That was good. I do like the Bren gun MG34, which settles for once and for all which is the best light machine gun of World War II. If anyone who follows me on Twitter or Matt, there's the endless, is it the Bren gun? Is it the Browning 30 caliber? Is it the MG42? Well, Star Wars go, well, we've just taken the body of the Bren, added the saddle mags MG34 and whatever other bits they brought in, and they've made a composite best light machine gun, which is interesting. So who's got a favorite bit of World War II equipment they've seen in the universe? Jess, you haven't spoken for ages. You must have seen something. You wouldn't come to me. Well, something else. Well, we haven't spoken to you for ages, so just
no. Well, it's been an interesting conversation. Like talking about this whole thing about like World War II and Star Wars and stuff. Like Lucas, I'm going to go back to Lucas again because it's basically what I've been reading. He didn't want to just make a silly sci-fi film, and obviously he made loads in film school and everything. But part of what he wanted to do was taking a kind of leaf out of Kurosawa's book, like something brilliant and epic, but something deep and emotional too. And I suppose back then, you have the old Westerns and stuff like that, but you can never get emotionally engrossed in it. Whereas, having all those war films and the fact that it was only, 20, 30 years after World War II had ended, there was still that emotion there. And obviously back then, a lot of people couldn't talk about it, and nobody wanted to listen. Like Webster's, when from Band of Brothers, when he wrote his book, nobody wanted to know. Nobody wanted to know what they went through. As far as they were concerned, the war's over, it's done. So I think Lucas, he wanted to actually like put that deep-seated emotion in it, partly to get people like engrossed in it and talking to it, like we're all talking about it now. And just that kind of like, emotions, there's little bits that everybody can get in touch with, like in tune with. Like some people, see themselves as givers of advice like Yoda, and the people see like, well, I'm a princess, or I'm not, don't worry. And
you are.
Open to discussion. But yeah, and just creating a mythology and a world, which is what the kids that generation were doing at the time, was trying to create their own world, which was not the war. They went, the war was fought so that they could have this freedom, and now this freedom, they were trying to bring it to life as best as they could.
Well, that's a very interesting topic you brought up, this idea of freedom, because one of the things I was going to bring up, and it's interesting that because you brought Luke up there as well, is Luke, we assume from A New Hope, was actually going to go and sign up to join the academy to become some kind of Empire pilot. That's what we assume from that. And then things happen around him. He ends up meeting Obi-Wan. He goes off on the Alliance side. But for a different path, he could have easily ended up a pilot of the Empire. Because one of the things that annoys me about with the World War II understanding is when I'm in Normandy, when veterans come over the anniversary and they get interviewed about why they were fighting in the war, they will say, I was fighting to bring back freedom to work to Europe, to liberate the people of Europe from the Nazi regime, and this, that, and the other. And I'm not saying that that is not why they did it. I'm saying that when men are fighting and women are fighting, they're fighting for the people beside them. And I think we, as viewers of the Star Wars, we see the clear good and the bad. We see the evil. We see the good. But if you're an average person who's either a stormtrooper on a Death Star or you're a Alliance, are you fully aware of the good? Because we get to see these high levels lightsaber duels between Yoda, and we've seen Count Dooku, we've seen all that. But if you're just a bloke or a woman in the universe, are you really aware of where good and evil is? Or is it the question of you were just joined up to fight in the first organization that came your way? Because in France, where I live, we get a lot of things about this idea of there's the Gaullist resistance, there's the communist resistance. People get labeled as a communist resistant. And I find that a lot of these people, you read their accounts, they were 21-year-old kid in Massif Central in France, and there was an opportunity to fight back. And it happened to be under the banner of a communist organization. And they signed up because it was a chance to shoot at the enemy, not because of the communist idea that was behind it. That was maybe the guy who set it up. But they were fighting because they wanted to fight, and they wanted to fight with their friends. So that, how much of that is reflected in the Star Wars universe? This idea of, are they really fighting for a cause, or are they just fighting because a group of them are either enlisted for the Empire or against the Empire, and they're fighting with their body? We don't see any camaraderie between the stormtroopers, but they must have had some, mustn't they?
You'd like
They
to
must
think
have
so.
had organization.
I mean, it comes back to, you don't, the stormtroopers and everything, where to go to the bathroom. Do they, most of the camaraderie, some of the camaraderie that you get in military and armed forces is going down the pub after like a day of training or something like that, or just before you're about to go off on a mission. And so, you wonder if the stormtroopers actually did do that. And there's a lot of spoof videos around like that, like about the anniversary of the blowing up of the Death Star and everything. But with the whole, do they actually know what's going on? Essentially, that's, I don't want to say essentially, but yes, like in World War One, the PALs, if they all lived on the same street, they wanted to be in the same, regiment, and they all wanted to fight together because it's what they knew. But as the world expanded, as technology expanded, and people could go, further away from home, that bubble gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as that gets bigger, your kind of sense of concentration and your sense of right and wrong can be corrupted in such a way, because you're bombarded with all this everything. And in a universe like the Star Wars universe, it would be difficult to figure out what's right and wrong if you're on the edge of well,
let's expand on that theme there, because I'll bring in staffers and carry that. But the stormtroopers, presumably they were either recruited forcibly or they volunteered, and whatever process, they would have gone through training. There would have been some kind of drill instructor, there would have been some kind of person issuing them their gear, they'd have been told about the history of their particular battalion, their company, and told about their proud. You were involved in it was our unit that 15 years ago was the ones that did this, this, and this, and they would have been caught up in their own history. So there's a strong suggestion, therefore, that when the stormtroopers are going into action on, let's say, Hoth, that they truly believed they were on the right side. They were the ones fighting for the right cause. They were fighting with their fellow soldiers. They trained alongside. They believed in their officers. They believed in their non-coms. They had been trained to do their job. So that we don't think about that. We don't acknowledge the fact that they probably thought they were doing the right thing. Staffers, what's your feeling on that?
So this might get controversial.
That's fine.
All right, so looking at it, let's look at World War II from a U.S. standpoint, where we had to basically grow an army of 250,000 active component, a couple 100,000 reserve component, up to an army of over 10 millions over the course of a couple of years. Your first enlistments, your first recruits, your volunteers are going to be the ones who know their unit's history. They feel very passionate. They know why they're fighting, blah, 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 patriotism, et cetera, et cetera. It's when you start getting your divisions up into their upper numbers, your 81st division, your 100 and whatever division, they're draftees. You've got draftees coming in and filling in. And yes, some of them are are gung ho. They go, all right, I wasn't really gonna go, or I wasn't gonna choose this thing. I was gonna go be an aircraft maintainer. I didn't really want to go be an infantryman. But you start looking at writings, soldier writings, and we have this idea of everyone in World War II as a hero. Well, everyone in World War II is a human being, and there's a good part of the human populace that isn't heroic. I would say that most of us are. We have our moment. I think everyone has their moments of heroism in their lives, and then there's everything else. There's the cowardice, there's the drunkenness, there's the shirking, there's the desertions, there's crime, there's everything that goes with war, because war degrades society. War takes society and degrades it down to a point where all the worst parts can just float up to the top, and we sort of mine some of those to focus them on the enemy and not against each other or against the civilian populace here around. And so I think if you look at some of the stormtroopers, because the stormtrooper corps was a combination of volunteers, conscripts. They kind of move and sometimes we're going to steal some babies from their parents and grow them up and make our own stormtroopers, and hopefully hopefully this will cause our help our readiness issues by not needing to recruit people, but you get people who the great moment in, I keep going back to Rogue One, or we'll go back to episode 4, where you've got the stormtroopers who are just covered in sand. And they're just wandering around this planet like, what in the hell are we looking for? Or the stormtroopers in Rogue One, where we're looking at Jin's prison transport. And you've just got 2 that are just sitting there. And I know that look so well, because it's the look of, they're slumped over, one sort of resting on his battle rifle. And they're going along, they're jolting along in the transport. I'm like, I've been that guy sitting in the back of a Bradley jolting along going, why did I sign up for this? Everything hurts. I haven't slept in a long time. This is where I am. This is where I am in my life. And so I think that's actually an accurate portrayal of, you get a lot of people who are just like, I'm just doing this because it's a job. Then you do have some who are sort of like glory for the empire, and you've got some crack units. But remember, this is a military that has to defend an entire galaxy. So they're going for mass over quality. And so they're not really, I don't think they're investing too much in the whole esprit de corps of things. But I like that the way that you pose that, because we do forget, what is the stormtroopers' motivation? What's their
that classic bit in A New Hope, when that these are not the droids you're looking for. To me, that's an example of, this is beyond my pay grade. There's 2 grunts there who haven't been in the military very long, who have been given very unspecific, very vague orders, and they've been told to look for something. They don't know why they're looking for it. They don't know what they've been looking for them for. And they can't be asked. They can't be really, but they don't really give a shit whether these are the droids. And Obi-Wan manages it. They don't care. In any other situation, they would go, actually, we ought to call our officer here. Let's go and get Lieutenant Smith, the guy who's been in. He'll make it. They don't really give a shit at all. That, to me, they're the most realistic kind of.
And the most realistic one happens in Mandalorian, end of season 1.
2 guys by the speeder.
It's perfect. I watched that dialogue and I went, that's every 2 soldiers, I don't care what army they are, left alone. And they're like, maybe we should shoot something. Maybe we should throw rocks at something. Maybe we should, talk shit about our superiors and wonder when we're going to eat, things of that nature. It was just spot on.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's
so one of the things I want to bring up. So one of the things I want to bring up, so you asked the question, do the stormtroopers believe that they're doing right? And I think some of that comes down to culture. So one of the things I'm constantly harping on in a lot of the things I write is it's the culture, not only of the unit they're in, it's the culture of where they were raised. Where were they raised? Where were they born? So for your draftees, that's going to be really tough for them to overcome. And they're probably going to have to just beat the mess out of them to be able to get them into that culture. It's that idea that we bring somebody in, we break them down, and then we build them up to that culture that we want. But if they're growing up in a place that doesn't have open media, that is extremely empire controlled. What was the other note? Sorry, I actually took notes as you guys were talking. No open media. They have a large, they don't have that larger perspective. So, your typical guy living on a farm like Luke may not have the larger perspective on what's going on in the war, what's going on Empire versus the rebellion. those are the guys that, hey, maybe they go, yeah, maybe I don't want to live on this farm, and maybe I do just want to conscript and sign up because, hey, it's 3 meals a day and it can't be any worse than, you know, working on a moisture farm. And so they're going to believe, and they're going to be the ones that are going to do as they're told because, hey, it's the easy way out. And I let somebody else do the thinking for me. And so, yeah, sure, of course, if they told me to do this, then yeah, it's the right thing to do, because why would they tell me anything otherwise? I have a information vacuum where I don't know any better. And that's just the culture that I have, you know, bred into the unit.
I'm going to bring Alan in a minute here. That's great stuff, because Alan, in his book, Browned Off and Bloody Minded, about the British soldier in World War II, one of the things that you talk about that is intrinsic to how the British Army functioned is this idea of doing stuff because it keeps your mind occupied. The blankering your webbing, stripping the blanker off your webbing, polishing your cap badges, dulling down your cap badges, pressing your trousers, then getting rid of the press, polishing your boots, dubboning your boots, polishing your boots. There's none of that in the Star Wars universe. I mean, stormtroopers, I can't think of anything on their gear to polish. There's nothing to iron. What are they told to do? Well, if you're a NCO stormtrooper and you've got a squad of stormtroopers, what do you give them to do when they're not missing people with their blasters? There must be some kind of meaningless task they are given, you know. Now we're going to do some marching up and down the Death Star. So everybody fall in, get in, lads.
Target practice.
You know, smallest on the left, largest on the right, by numbers, stormtroopers, 1, 2, everything done in army time, 1, 2, 3, sir. There's none of that being shown. I mean, if only Jack, who joined us at the beginning, Jack McKenzie, could have come on, because Jack, who was in Empire Strikes Back, was a former Royal Marine, and I wonder whether they went into filming in Empire Strikes Back with any kind of military discipline. I did a couple of films as a military extra. I was in No Bananas, a series for London Weekend Television years and years ago, and we were all formed up. We were marched down to the set in formation. We were given foot drill, we were given rifle drill, and we were taken onto the set as a military formation. We were taken off set as a military formation. This is a mixture of ex-squaddies and non-squaddies and blah, blah, blah. But we were treated it that way. So Alan, why are they not showing any blancoing and, you know, polishing of gear in the Star Wars universe? And should that be a big part of the next film? When there's lots of stormtroopers sitting around just whatever.
Well, it always strikes me that you never hear stormtroopers swearing, or talking about sex, or talking about leave, or complaining about their officers. And, you know, the conversations always strike me as incredibly boring. And maybe they're just boring blokes, I don't know. But they certainly don't seem to be preoccupied with the kinds of things that soldiers typically are. So one of the thought I had kind of about this was we were talking about motivations. And, you know, it strikes me actually that the rebels have not thought about this at all. And their own concept of what you might call war aims is incredibly superficial. And I mean, if you think about what their, you know, the way that they market their appeal to recruits, they must have it, you know, they're having to sort of try and actively recruit, you know, dissidents from all across the empire, is, you know, well, we're going to restore freedom to the galaxy. Now, you know, if you were, you know, now we know the story of the prequels, of course, and this was all well within living memory at the time of A New Hope, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at the prequels and you can say, you know, the Galactic Republic was an absolute disaster. It fell to pieces. It was rotten. It was corrupt. Why the hell would you want to go back to that anyway? It was worse than in some respects than the Empire. I mean, at least the Empire makes an argument that they brought order and peace and so and so. What exactly does going back to the Galactic Republic offer you? You know, I mean, the analogy, I guess, with World War II is that, you know, certainly post 1940 in Britain, you know, the idea of returning to the pre-war status quo antebellum is not one that you know, has an appeal to an increasingly large number of people, and so they have to think seriously about, you know, the new kind of world that we're going to create, both in terms of, you know, domestic policy, social policy, the Beveridge Report, and so on, and then also in this broader sense about a new international order, the United Nations, and new ways of thinking about maintaining peace and so on. And there doesn't seem to be a slightest bit of consideration of this in the. I mean, what after Return of the Jedi, they just go back to having the same crappy old republic that they did before. Because I mean, I'm not enough. I don't know enough about the interim between that and the most recent set of films that they made, but the whole thing fell apart again pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, it
By the
did.
looks of it. And you've got the First Order showing up, who seem to be just having replaced the Galactic Empire without too much difficulty. And you've got to wonder, it's like, what are the rebels fighting for exactly? Because their whole concept about what in a negative sense, you can see they're fighting against the Empire, but in a positive sense, they don't seem to offer a great deal. And if I was a young moisture farmer's son, on Tatooine, kind of wondering what I'm going to do with my life. And one of my other thoughts as well is what's going on at the Imperial Academy, because it seems like half the people that go there immediately desert, having learned all of their tactics. They then go off to the rebels. I mean, do they not, do any vetting or sort of try and cadet retention or anything like that? But why would you want to go back to this crappy system that never did anything for you anyway and fell apart immediately? So
that's a good point. And maybe, sorry to interrupt, that's maybe that, because there's the whole thing about why Luke goes off and lives on his planet on his own. Is there a Luke Churchill kind of connection there, in that during World War II, we had given the British soldier and the American this idea there's going to be a better future, and Clement Attlee comes in, right, for my money is our greatest 20th century prime minister, and maybe Luke had to go. The remaining Jedi had to go. It's like, we needed you to get rid of the Nazis, the Empire, but we actually don't want you, so now fuck off, as we kind of did to Churchill. That kind of, thank you very much, but you're not what we want now. Maybe in a sense, what the rebels were fighting for was not what they were fighting for. They were fighting to get rid of, as you said, Alan, of both things. They didn't like the Empire, but going back to the Galactic Empire, and perhaps Yoda and the Jedi kind of represent that kind of Victorian pre-Empire values that were not what the moisture farmers, the people who had the Poe Damerons and the Finns, they didn't want that. They wanted something new. Perhaps they didn't know what they wanted, but they knew that what they didn't want was the old Galactic Republic with Luke Skywalker representing the other values. I mean, this is interesting stuff, and I think we will have to kind of stop in about 2. We've been at it nearly 2 hours now. We can come back and do this again if we want to. But
I do have a theory about the
Matt, go for it, please.
The New Republic, because if you think about it, if you're watching The Mandalorian, I have issues with it, but we won't get into that. Basically, what you're seeing there is werewolf in action. You have the remnants of the Empire going to ground and waiting for a moment. And you know what we don't see, or we haven't seen yet. There's Paul Sung-Hang Lee's character mentioned something about what's going on with people in the inner rim, but you wonder if there's a Nuremberg, or whether it's the greatest personal sheen epic going on with these former Imperials slotting into new roles a la West Germany with their backstories slightly cleaned, waiting for another opportunity. That's kind of my thinking, because that's the only way in such a short period of time it can all flip around again. But you sort of look at what they're doing with the spin-off stuff at the moment, and it is fascinating, because you do have a lot more on the ground impact of it. And one of the things that we never talk about when we talk about Star Wars is loss, or radicalization, because you could say Luke was radicalized when his aunt and uncle were killed. That's the reason why he joins the Empire, because you a lot of the research I do on pilots on both Luftwaffe and on the Allied side is they wanted to fly. So where do you go to fly? You sign up, and if you're lucky, you're going to get a plane. So if you're a moisture farmer, where are you going to go if you can actually want to fly the hot, cool stuff, or at least get off that planet? You're going to sign up for, the Navy, basically. And yet you have this situation where in A New Hope, Luke says, no, I'm going with my plan, and he gets home and all his family's dead, and that's why he goes off with Ben. There's a off pieces of fantastic book called American War about the radicalization of a girl in a future American Civil War, and it's that same sort of story that she's not going along with it until something bad happens and there's this schism. And I think you can see that completely unintentionally in A New Hope with us looking back with the eyes that we have. But the loss element, one of the really good moments in the latest series of The Mandalorian, besides Katie Sackhoff showing up, is there's a standoff on a KR is with me. There's a standoff on a shuttle where a guy says, "You killed 2 million people in the Death Stars," and it all goes horribly quiet. It's the elephant in the room, and Kevin Smith's made a complete career out of that one gag in Clerks about what about all the
construction workers,
the construction workers on the second Death Star. And mind you, so's the robot chicken guys doing all the menial stuff with how do you go to the loo in a stormtrooper outfit, or what do you chat about? We've grown up on Where Eagles Dare with unlimited ammo and unlimited range of people popping up to shoot. We now have Call of Duty where we can do that for fun on our own. But we watch these films and you don't actually, I look at them now and think, goodness, that Star Destroyer's got 10,000 people on it and it's just exploded. That Super Star Destroyer's got 100,000 people on it. It could just be me jaded and spending far too much time reading logbooks that suddenly get stamped red saying killed in action, that you just start thinking, well, hang on a second, what is the cost of all this? And you could bring in the fact that when we look at World War II, you've got the Indian famine, you've got the various issues of people dying of they're not directly related to the war. They're not, but they are because of things happening. There's supply shortages, food. So you have, and I think
in the Blitz really.
The collateral damage aspect.
Bystanders.
Is very interesting. And as you say, Kevin Smith and his old construction workers, and also I think we could bring in staffers and KR on this. But the idea that people join the Empire because it's a route out of poverty as well. How many people in the current British Army or American military armies are there because it's either, I know it's maybe a cliche, but it's, some of my Band of Brothers, from people like Jimmy Madio in the Bronx, it was you either go into crime or you become an actor. And how many people who are in the Empire, it was either, working in some awful coal mine or joining the army, seeing the world. I mean, can you be blamed for joining the organization because you want a better life for yourself? And maybe again with World War II, you have a lot of the SOE and agents. They're independently wealthy. Some of the people in France who are leading resistance networks, they own chateaus. They're not going to be broken by the war. It's the people at the bottom who have nothing to eat. If you're in France or Yugoslavia and you've got no food and you're in the Czechoslovakia, do you join up because it's that way is how you feed your family? How many of the Dutch SS, for example, joined the Dutch SS because it was a means of feeding their families? That's another whole interesting subject.
There was also just like with the Germans as well. It was just there like join the Nazi party. No, okay, we're going to kill you. Join or die. That was
exactly.
The choice most of the time. And of course, to begin with, it was like, oh, he's bringing us out of austerity and giving us jobs and a new hope, basically a new hope he was giving them. And then it descended into chaos. But then, like as Trotsky said, he's a madman. He's a madman with a vision, and they're much more difficult to stop and to tell them that this isn't going to work. No matter how many times you say that to them, they just won't believe it because it's so ingrained in their own brain that they just can't listen to anybody else but themselves.
And another interesting thing is, apart from in Attack of the Clones, when they're in the bar and there's the racing being shown on TV, we have no idea about what media exists in the Star Wars universe, have we? So if you're living on some remote planet in some remote system, what information are you being fed about the war? Who are you being told are the goodies and the baddies? What is your information? Because do they have Twitter? Do they have social media? If you are a moisture farmer on Tatooine, what are you being told about what's going on? Because Luke's looking up there and there's like a star battle happening. Does he have any idea about? Is there a Goebbels in the Empire? Is there a Ministry of Propaganda for the Alliance? That is another interesting thing about how. Anyone got any ideas about how they are spreading their information? What brings anyone?
They actually address this in Solo,
Right.
when Han is separated from Kira, and he's got to figure out a way to get himself set up to come back for her. He passes by propaganda for the Empire. And my favorite thing about that is that the Empire's theme song is the Imperial theme from the original trilogy.
Yeah.
So they put that into the canon. But yeah, it is, AR brought up, it's state-controlled media. It is propaganda. This is my current project is on propaganda and recruitment and advertising. And that's brand new in World War II. But a lot of I'm seeing a lot of the same practices being showcased in the Star Wars material, in the Star Wars shows, movies rather. And it's a lot of kind of very black and white, we are good, they are bad kind of propaganda being used and advertising being used. They talk about vidnets and infonets and things like that, where it sounds like there's an intergalactic or at least interplanetary internet. And we all know how well controlled our internet is, but maybe there's a big push from the Empire to get their version of the story out on their version of the internet. But yeah, definitely they do use straight up state propaganda, at least in Solo.
That's a good point. I'd forgotten that. And also we have to think as well about how both sides, the Empire and the Alliance, how they show to people who've never seen it, how the whole Force thing works. Because famously in Star Wars, Han thinks it's a hokey religion. He's never even seen it. We because we've seen the movies, we've seen the people of shifting things with their hands. But if you're, again, I'm going to say a moisture farm on Tatooine, you may have heard about this magic, but you're thinking that I'm shoveling shit from some bantha every day. I haven't seen any magic in my fucking life. There may be magic out there. I've seen none of it. Why isn't there any magic helping me clear up this bantha shit? That's what why don't I get a bit ability to get rid of something? So how do you sell the idea of, but our side has this mystical power behind it? Or do you reckon they just ignored that? Do you reckon that's not going to recruit stormtroopers by advertising some kind of magic they can't see? They've got to do it the tried and tested. You'll be part of a brotherhood. I'll bring Matt in, I think.
The Empire isn't using the Force, though. They're not emphasizing that. The Empire is moving away from it. Back to the point about Star Wars and Tolkien that Alan made at the start. The Empire is much more technologically based, and they are moving away from using the Force and this ancient religion. And it's much more common to hear it in rebel and resistance circles, may the Force be with you, or things like that. And even that seems more of kind of a reflex of something from their culture that they've inherited that they maybe don't leave. Think about, people who are atheists. When someone sneezes, they say, God bless you. They don't believe that the person's soul is leaving their body, but they know what you say. So I think
there is a bit of a have a nice day about it, isn't there? When you see some of the junior rebels going, there is a bit of a have a nice day, enjoy your fries with that. There's a bit of we say it because our supervisors have told us we must say that at the end of every speech, may the Force be with you.
It's a thing. Like part of their society this is what you say. It feels much more reflexive in that sense, more of a social contract than a requirement within their structure, within their hierarchy. Because it seems like they're really leaning into that World War II military hierarchy within all of the organizations we see, but using kind of invoking the Force in that way feels much more cultural, much more unconscious, something that they're not really thinking that they're invoking this magical thing, but instead that they are saying, I wish you well, and I wish strength and victory to us in this way. So I think that bringing the Force into recruiting is not going to be a thing that's really happening, because it doesn't feel like it is an important component of their practice, of their tactics, of strategy.
It's just a hard sell, isn't it? I mean, the technology side is easy to sell. If you put big AT-ATs and walkers and things on the planets, you can say, here's what the Empire has. We have these shiny things that do this shiny stuff and they fire. But how do you explain the Force? You send the apprentice Jedis around to kind of move apples around in front of people, so they go, oh wow, I'm signing up with that. They can make apples float across the room. It's a hard sell to explain how the Force works to people lower down the chain of command. As you kind of say, you have kind of showbiz Jedis who just go out. They're the equivalent, the recruiting officers, I guess. They sit in office, the alliance, and you go in there, and they just show, we can do this, and the sellotape dispenser goes across the desk and lands there. And they go, that's why you're signing up with us. And they go, fucking hell, he's a level 1, because are there practitioners of the Force who are at lower level? Are there people who never get out of, like marksmen? We only see the Jedis who are good at this Force stuff. Are there people who are just shit at it, who have to have lowly jobs? And the only Force they can muster is kind of broomstick sweeping. I don't know. We're going off a tangent now.
I think one of the interesting things about what Star Wars has allowed is the answering of these questions in other films and media.
Yeah,
I think with the 89 different series of Star Wars we've had announced recently, they'll probably delve into this. But I think going back to your how do you recruit, how do you communicate? Someone who grew up during the war and saw it firsthand, Paul Verhoeven, nailed it in Starship Troopers. Do you want to know more? That little clip, which bears no resemblance to the book, but that wasn't the point. He was basically making a movie about the Empire and fascism that he grew up with. But that element, those little vid clips of here's a little something. Do you want to know more? That same element that we have on news today, with lots of flashy squares that draw us in, and you listen to the most inane crap for 10 minutes. And I think that's the Star Wars legacy has meant that artists and filmmakers and some of the guys that you had on your comic show as well have been able to explore another medium that the canon stuff would never allow, because it is darker. It is the things that the galaxy far, far away that at the end of the day needs to sell the lunchbox isn't really going to get into, because that'll be a rating that's too high for Disney Plus. But because of this huge influence that it's had, we now have all these other things, whether you look at possibly the best sci-fi on telly at the moment, which is The Expanse, and that's delving into lots of things that Star Wars would never go near, with polyamorous relationships, with the detailed issues of politics and the results of decisions that do cost lives, and what that does to people and how they get radicalized. That's only possible because of Star Wars, but it's also something that you will never see in a Star Wars canon show.
Well, I think we ought to bring things to an end fairly soon, but I think we bring it back to our central theme about the World War II and Star Wars connection. I suppose if you're a writer working on one of these new projects and you're just told you can do whatever you want, it's a universe of unlimited possibilities, that's almost so much to think about. You don't know how you would focus on it. But those like Alan, who writes about World War II for a living, and others here have spoken about it, if they were to tell their writers, well, look, kind of base everything off World War II, there's enough within World War II to examine and say, okay, let's keep it within something that we can kind of directly connect to that, either civilian atrocities, either gender roles, either resistance movements. It would give them somewhere to if a publisher said to Alan, you can write about whatever you want at all, you don't know where to start. If someone says, I'd like you to tackle this, it focuses your mind, and it means you can at least kind of think, well, okay, this is where I'm going to start my research. And I think that's why maybe the writers of these should look more at World War II to kind of ground everything they're doing and say, okay, if we can connect everything there, it will also help our writing, but it will also get our audience to have this sense of familiarity. We'll be watching something that we are vaguely familiar with already. Does that make sense, folks? Am I on? Yeah, sort of keep it grounded in something we understand. Hence that awful scene with the bombers, but we did kind of relate to it, didn't we? We kind of got the imagery, even though it was silly, but we did kind of get this Germany and Bremen and kind of, anyway.
But
I
to
think
be
we'll
fair, I'm
bring
pretty
people.
sure
Hey,
most of
who's
us
got
on
some
this call
final
would
point?
know
Any
how to
final
defend
point to
against
make?
that.
Because I think we're going to lose people. We're going to be starting, going and volunteering to join the Empire. It involves not listening to us anymore. So people will be joining up. But who's got any last kind of points to make about this World War II Star Wars thing? Anyone who wants to go and Matt, I knew you were going to put your hand up.
I
Matt.
know. I think what's interesting now is we're probably going to see Star Wars move on from World War II. Yeah, I think with the Mandalorian, some of the things that it's raised, we're going to be looking at more, the more recent conflicts that, the writers themselves have gone through. You'll have the overarching themes that we're used to with a lot of the tech, but I think we're going to actually see it move forward and start, delving into, ironically, the stuff Battlestar Galactica was looking at 20 years ago, but that sort of more focused reaction to it. And say what you will about the actress who plays Cara Dune, her character is suffering from PTSD. So what they're going to do with her going forward is going to be very interesting. And I think what will be interesting for me is what Star Wars does next. Does it keep itself rooted in these sort of mythoses that we spend our time in, or will it bring it up to date?
That's a very good point. And to me, as a Star Wars fan, although I'm not a geek, I don't read the expanded universe. What I love about it is this sense of it does feel familiar, even though it's fantastic. There is a sense of recognition of that's Dunkirk, that's like the Winter War of 1940, and the themes are kind of universal. While other science fiction series kind of leave me a bit dead because they're too silly. The silver foil kind of that kind of stuff. Anyway, right. I think we've tackled some stuff. People have stayed with us. A few people have drifted away and come back again, but people have stayed with us. I think people have enjoyed it. Some people, great job, panel, said Dave in Virginia. So that's good. That was at least one person has liked it. So that's good. So I think we will call it an end then, folks. And this is our last World War II TV show of 2020. We've got more stuff coming up in the new year. Of course, lots more panel discussions, interviews, Battlefield live streams. I would like to do something else Star Wars because I like it. I think there's more value here. The difficulty with planning this, folks, was knowing kind of where the boundaries were. Like with the universe, what do we talk about? Do we just talk about weapons we've seen, or do we kind of go into some broader themes? And I think we've kind of done some good stuff this evening. We've brought up some interesting themes. We've made some good points, and I think it'll be fun to go play back and look again. So it remains for me to say thank you very much to my panel for joining us. It's been really good. I wish Jack had managed to hang around and he got his microphone working, because that would have been great to hear about someone working on Empire Strikes Back. But it gives us an excuse to do a second panel at some point in the future. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody else. Jess, KR, Dana. It's been really good. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV. I've got a little bit of old speckled hen left. I will see you all again. And
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody. We'll see you in the
everybody.
new year. So thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again. Well,